Did you know that on any given day in Ohio there are roughly 1,000 people missing? That number got my attention when dispatch reporters Max Filby and Danae King first pitched an investigative report on missing people across Ohio. The work since that meeting several months ago led to several revelations detailed in Vanished, an exclusive new series available now on Dispatch.com. Hello, I'm Mike Shearer, Executive Editor of Columbus Dispatch and Dispatch.com. I'm here today with King and Filby to speak about this project. Along with photojournalist Barbara Parenchik, they crisscrossed Ohio in recent months speaking to families and authorities. Thanks for sitting down with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Great. All right, so how did this project come about? What made you start looking into the issue of missing people in Ohio?
Well, I think we both kind of have an answer to this. So I know, Mike, when you started here in January, you kind of challenged the staff to come up with kind of a really big idea. And Danae and I took that to heart and started looking at things and different topics to report on. Kind of one of the things we were looking for was something that included a lot of real people who we could focus on and share their stories, you know, somebody who could put a face on an issue. Something that had a lot of public data, which Missing Persons does, and we'll get to that a little bit more later, I'm sure. And then something or some place or agency that could be held accountable where there might be room for reform or improvement. And Danae, I know you kind of have a story as well about why this is important.
Yeah, like Max said, we were looking into different things that we could hold people accountable with and really show these stories. As an underserved communities reporter, I felt it was really important because these families and people are underserved. You know, they often feel ignored or their cases aren't known about. And last year, actually, I covered one of these cases when I was on a COPS shift, the case of Amina Alhaj Omar. She went missing and was found, you know, a month later dead in a quarry, and I got to sit down with her family last year. And that really showed me that sometimes these families have to become their own detectives and do this work to find their missing loved ones, and that's what her sisters did. So it kind of all came together in that way, with us looking for, you know, these stories and then me having a personal example that I'd reported on.
So what are your major findings? I mean, you already shared a bit there, the first one in terms of people may have to be their own detectives if they have a loved one go missing, which I'd like to come back to a bit later. But what did you guys learn in all your work here in the last few months?
Yeah, so a lot of what we learned came from these families themselves. So one was Amina's family. They shared with me right away there was really no playbook for what to do. So we learned that these families are often, you know, don't know what to do. They feel like they're not getting help from police. And like I said, have to become their own detective. And then we also found that there were families who felt like they'd been written off or dismissed by police. You know, one woman, her husband went missing at Easton Town Center, and she called police to report, and they said, do you know how many reports of this we get? You know, he's not a senior citizen, he's not a kid. And she was like, well, he's missing, and I only have one husband. You know, I only have one father for my kid. So she really felt dismissed. And then others, you know, they have missing loved ones and they can't even get a hold of police to file a report or follow up on a case. So we found a lot of those stories.
Yeah, and just in Ohio too, the number of missing persons has increased over the last 3 years by nearly 18%. More than 22,000 missing Ohioans were reported last year. You know, nationally, it's estimated roughly 600,000 Americans vanish every year. The DOJ several years ago referred to this as the nation's silent massacre because it's happening right in front of us. You know, it might not look like some of the other natural disasters or warfare or attacks, but there really are comparable numbers of people going missing every year to some of those.
The numbers are staggering. You mentioned 22,000 Ohioans a year and 600,000 nationally. Can you help us understand that number a bit better? What's the scope of the problem here? I mean, that's the people who actually reported missing too, of course. There are others who may not get reported missing.
No, that's absolutely right. And you know, like I said, over 22,000 last year. That's down from a peak a few years ago of roughly 25,000, but it's been on the upswing the last 3 years. You know, just here in Columbus too, police are receiving thousands of reports of missing persons every year. It's a staggering number compared to some of the other incidents reported to police. It's one of the most common too.
Okay. So it's one of the most common reported cases to police. but it's also one that I think gets the least attention. There are a few high-profile cases of people go missing that get local or national attention, but there's a lot more that never get any ink in the media or any airtime in the media or a public plea from the police for help. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's definitely accurate. What we've found is for these cases to get publicity, it might start with the police, whether they're sending out a media release or posting on social media or doing some kind of alert, like an Amber Alert. But oftentimes the reason cases get so much publicity are the families. They just don't stop. They're calling newspapers, they're calling TV stations, they're really putting this information out there. And that's how some of these quote unquote famous cases that we know about really get that notice and publicity. And if there's not the family or the police doing that work on the back end, then oftentimes people may not even know somebody is missing. We as citizens might not, know how many people are missing or even if someone is or not.
Now, I recall from reading your stories that I think Columbus Police have 8 people in this division searching for missing people, which seems like a lot for the problem, perhaps. But kind of what do the police tell you about how they handle these cases and their perspective on this issue?
Yeah, sure. So Columbus Police last year received more than 3,900 reports of missing persons. Like you mentioned, Mike, there's 8 detectives tasked with investigating those. That adds up to hundreds of cases, per detective. So while 8 might seem like a lot, they're dealing with several every day. Now, the way police try to handle these is they have to prioritize them, right? We had one officer tell us, it's kind of like an ER. You might have a bunch of people coming in at once, but not everything can be treated at once. So they prioritize it by way of age, by way of circumstances, if foul play is suspected and whatnot. It's really a balancing act for police.
Okay. And do you think they're overwhelmed by these cases, or what do they say about that?
Well, so Columbus Police told us specifically that they don't feel overwhelmed or overrun, but they very much acknowledged just the fact that when you're getting thousands of cases a year, you kind of you just have to handle them as you can. Not everything is probably going to get the same attention as another case, and that's where the prioritization comes in.
Yeah, and just to add to that, they actually have asked for more people, more detectives in that unit. And, they're kind of waiting on a response to that. I believe it was put on hold. But what we've talked to national experts about is Columbus is kind of one of the lucky divisions. They get 8 dedicated missing persons detectives. Most departments don't have a missing persons division or unit, and they're using homicide detectives and other officers to kind of investigate these cases if they're able to.
And there is some interesting stuff when it comes to how they prioritize cases too. Like for instance, there is an age cutoff for a case that's considered high risk. So any Columbus child who goes missing who's over the age of 10 is not considered high risk. Which we found to be a really interesting finding because, one, that differs all across the state. In different cities, it might be 13 or 14 or 12. But I also just thought it was interesting because I don't know that I myself, as an 11-year-old, I don't know how well I would do necessarily out on my own.
Okay. So you both sat down with a lot of families during this process, reporting this project. Tell me about their stories. And you mentioned Amina a few minutes ago, and that's the lead example in the main story that we are publishing here on Sunday is about her disappearance. So tell me a little bit about that and just more about what these families are going through in their experiences here.
Yeah, so families describe this as kind of unlike anything else. It's not losing a loved one. It's not burying someone and having that certainty that they're gone or knowing what happened to them. There's a lot of uncertainty in this process. So coping with having a missing loved one is really hard. In Amina's case, they did eventually find her deceased, but she, stopped replying to her sister's texts and they couldn't get a hold of her or find where her phone location was. And so, she had been diagnosed a few years before with schizophrenia, and her family were worried. They were like, we don't know what happened to her. We're worried she could be in danger somehow. And police at first kind of wrote that off until The sisters were able to find video of her in a gas station, kind of holding knives for her protection and wandering around, kind of looking scared and uncertain. And then police took that seriously, and a few weeks later she was found. But during that process, and there's so many families out there who their loved one has never been found. So I think it's a balance of, these families say when they cope with it, it's a balance of like not losing hope, but it's hard not to lose hope when it's been 10, 20 years since you've seen a loved one. So one of the people we talked to, this is another story in our reporting, is this woman's best friend went missing. And the way she copes is every single night when she gets home from work, she emails somebody who can help her find her best friend. So it's like kind of this consistent thing that people, struggle to cope with.
Yeah, and I think you kind of alluded to it at the start of your what you were saying, Danae, is that this is really kind of like unlike anything else, right? When you have a loved one who dies, you know what's happened to them. There is a finality to that. It's obviously very sad and tragic at times, but we spoke to families who told us that this limbo of not knowing that they're in, not knowing what police are doing after years pass, not knowing if their loved one's still alive or dead, that really weighs on families.
Oh, I could have to, absolutely. So one of the things that we talked about in our reporting is the situation with runaways. There are teenagers who run away every day. They're upset with their parents, or for what could be minor to very serious reasons. We write about one young lady in Akron who ran away from an abusive situation and ended up being dead, if you found dead after she ran away a few times. But there were others, a lot of cases where they may just run over to their boyfriend or girlfriend's house. They may just be upset with something. How do police cope with runaways? Because that makes up a big part of these numbers, obviously.
Yeah, so there's several kids, more than half a year, that law enforcement and the Ohio Attorney General's office and police label as runaways. So one of the first things we learned about this from national experts and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which really specializes in missing kids, is that that's a misnomer, I guess. They stopped using the term runaway years ago because people stopped looking at these posters of kids. So we still use it here in Ohio. Our law enforcement does. But an interesting thing is that police do kind of a triage with these cases. They say, what age are they? Is it likely they just left because they were upset with their parents?
What you're saying, Danae, is a lot of the times it can be a kid who runs away from home because they're upset with a parent or something, right? But a lot of the times runaways are running from something, whether it be something like abuse in the home, one case that we reported about, or any number of issues that are affecting them, bullying, things like that. So the issue I think that we kind of found is that the term runaway, it's very commonly used, very widely used, but it can mean a number of different things.
Well, you guys report on a young man who escaped from one of the, I don't forget, the juvenile detention center or a treatment center, I believe it was. And he ran away, and they classified that as a runaway, even though he ran away from a residential program and was eventually found dead a few weeks later. So that struck me as, that seemed like more than a runaway that I associate the term with as a kid who just left home.
Yeah, the point that kind of kept coming back for us is, like, no matter what, these children are in danger. A kid out there on their own, they're in danger. They're more susceptible to, human trafficking and things like that. And they're just not equipped to live on their own. But when police see some of these cases where kids run away, 100 times over a course of, several years or a couple years, something they do is really try to get these kids help. So that's counseling with children's services agencies. That's, getting the court involved and trying to get their parents involved to make it so that if these kids are, repeat runaways, they make sure that they're looking at what they might be running from and why they're going away from home and really try to help them. So it really depends on the circumstances of the case, but I know when we talked to police, one of the things they said was, we try to get them help.
Okay. So in your reporting, you guys found that there were a lot of people, missing people, Their names also are missing from a federal database that Ohio law enforcement are supposed to update. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to make this as not confusing as possible. I'm going to throw a couple of different named databases out there. But so in Ohio, children have long been required to be reported to something called the National Crime Information Center. It's a database that the FBI runs. Separately, there is this missing persons database called the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System that has existed since 2007. Now, for the first one, the National Crime Information Center, we found that while police are reporting children to it, they often are leaving out things like photos, which, could be critical in identifying somebody who's missing, and things like race and whatnot, too. Several entries also didn't have any circumstances or narrative details about a person's disappearance. Now, NamUs, the other one, is what it's called for short, the one that's existed since 2007. That is exclusively meant for missing persons and unidentified bodies. There's no state requirement in Ohio for police to report missing persons to that. 16 other states do require it. So we cross-referenced a lot of these databases. The Attorney General's office in Ohio also has one as well, I might add, that pulls from one of these. But we found that roughly 366 Ohio children have been missing for at least 1 year. Of those, 89% or 327 have not been entered into NamUs, the database that is meant exclusively for missing persons and unidentified bodies.
Yeah, and the importance of entering a child into that database is that they could be anywhere in the country. And if they're in this database, another police department in another state or jurisdiction could, find this information and potentially identify these children.
And it's no small thing either. I mean, NamUs has helped to solve more than 46,000 cases since 2007 too. So it's a valuable tool that we basically found that law enforcement are regularly not using.
Okay. And I know for part of this project, you sat down with the Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost and talked to him about these issues and your findings. What was his kind of reaction to your questions?
Yeah, so Attorney General Yost said that he's made missing persons a priority for his time in office. As I mentioned a minute ago, his office does have a statewide database that it pulls from the National Crime Information Center. Now, when we pressed him about issues that we've heard from families about problems with police investigating or not investigating missing persons cases, he did largely say that those issues were not his fault. He sort of threw the blame on local police chiefs and mayors. Now, at the same time, we asked him about should there be some law changes to require some of these reporting to these national databases. And he said, yeah, that he thinks it could be time for that. He said that we can't keep doing things the way we've always done them.
And training of officers is also an issue here. It's missing persons, if I recall, was a very limited number of hours of the officers' academy time.
Yeah, for basic training, we crunched the numbers, and it was roughly 2%. I believe, Danae, correct me if I'm wrong, it was around 14 hours of what up until the end of June was at least 740 hours worth of basic training.
Yeah, and another issue with that, Attorney General Yost even said this, is that's basic training. That's before you become a cop, or a police officer. So once you're doing these cases and investigating missing people, you might not even remember that training. So he said, it's important that we do more of this training along the way for officers.
And the state does offer different police departments around Ohio opportunities for that training, but it's not required.
All right. So we talked about this a little bit already, but I want to get into the issue of Amber Alerts here because I think there's a public perception that there's very few Amber Alerts. We had one here last week in Columbus. But since 2010, more than 250,000 reports of missing children have been filed in Ohio. So in 14 years, that's a staggering number to me. But only 134 Amber Alerts have been issued. Why are there so few Amber Alerts with so many children missing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Amber Alerts, they have to meet a very narrow definition. So police have to be able to prove that the child was abducted and that they're in danger, that their lives are in danger, their safety is threatened. So, there's an average of 9 Amber Alerts sent out in Ohio per year. And we've seen that some of the perception is that those are the only missing children.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that's not the case. There's more like around 20,000 kids missing per year. So it's just that very narrow definition that really limits Amber Alerts. But the experts we talked to said that's not the only way you can tell people that children are missing. In Ohio, there's an endangered missing children alert that is a lower threshold for alert. You can be, labeled a runaway and still get that alert. You still have to be in danger. And only about 10 on average of those are sent out per year in Ohio. But there's also, flyers and social media and, other ways that the public can be notified.
And just in general, I think while there are these stringent guidelines for an Amber Alert, a lot of it comes down to what police know in the moment. And a lot of times they might not know necessarily if a child is in serious danger. Mike, I know earlier you mentioned the Akron case that we did some reporting on. A 13-year-old named Melanie Elkins. She ran away from home 3 times. And the 3rd time she went missing, she wound up dead. But police did not issue an Amber Alert for her because they did not believe that her life was at serious risk.
Yeah, and the other thing is police and the Ohio Attorney General's office said it's really important not to desensitize the public to this.
Yeah.
They don't want to send out too many Amber Alerts because then people start ignoring them. So I think that's an important point they made as well.
No, absolutely. We don't want to be crying wolf every time it happens, and but then it seems like there's maybe a middle ground there somewhere too. So,
right.
All right. So, kind of working to the end of our questions here, but based on what you've learned in these past few months, if someone's loved one goes missing, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, this is a question we tried to ask every family, every advocate that we spoke to, because, something that all of them expressed to us is there's no guidebook for this. It's hard to know what to do when your loved one goes missing, and it's scary.
No.
So, they have many different tips. One of them is, make sure that you're recording everything, write everything down. Know when you reported things, have the officer's name, keep details of when things were done. Another is just to, get some help, have support you can rely on, people to talk to. Help me out, Max. What are some other ones?
Yeah, I think kind of the biggest takeaway is really that if you have a friend or a loved one who goes missing, you need to be prepared to be their biggest advocate. Because the reality is that police do deal with thousands of these cases every year, and they're short-staffed. We know that. So you have to kind of be the one to go out and do the footwork, to hang the missing persons posters, to, we had one family walk a homeless camp and stuff, looking and asking people about their missing loved one. So you really have to be the one who's going to be out there, out front, advocating for your missing friend or family member.
Yeah, and keep, pushing police and asking for their help, and advocate for yourself. Like we talked about Amina's case quite a bit, and her sisters were the ones who were walking a homeless camp to look for her. They drove around Columbus trying to see if they could find her. They hung flyers. They didn't let police kind of say, no, it's not a big deal. And they were the ones who found a video that made police really, pay attention.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both. It's a great project, and there are elements of the project, the text part of it, that do give tips and advice to people too. So.
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right, great. Well, thanks to Max and Danae for joining us today. Be sure to check out their work on dispatch.com and in print November 17th through 21st. You can also check out some of the compelling videos that we have also with the project. So next week on From the Editor, we'll be discussing Franklin County's new prosecutor, Shayla Favor, who was elected recently. And she'll become the first woman and first person of color to serve as Franklin County prosecutor when she's sworn in next year. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.